We're going to get into now force velocity profiling. And as we start to think about Flywheel, we're trying to address the gaps or limitations with gravity-based resistance. And I'm not trying to overly make a binary like, hey, you're a gravity-based person and you're a flywheel. Like you don't have to choose. You don't have to be limited by one, right? You're not going to fill your facility with 100% flywheel. But also, too, that a lot of us are probably 100% gravity-based resistance. And that's going to create a lot of blind spots. And one thing to kind of address this is looking through traditional force velocity curves, which, for the record, is going to be primarily associated with gravity-based resistance. So force and velocity and the continuum that creates, that's 100% off the guise of what is the force velocity relationship to gravity. And albeit, like, again, like we have a lot of tools to be very selective and write better prescriptions of where I need to focus my attention. But a lot of that can be really fast-tracked and organized in a way that's just more efficient and probably more effective if I can insert some different types of resistance profile that's not limited by gravity. So the first thing to work through is this contraction type force velocity curve, right? So we know that eccentric is lengthening, we know that isometric is static, and then we know a concentric is shortening. And with that comes a relationship to the amount of force and subsequently the amount of velocity in which we can move with, right? So we look at eccentric as the strongest of the contraction types that has the highest force potential. So I can lengthen or lower weight at a way higher ceiling than I could concentrically, right? That we are limited in a gravity environment or gravity-based resistance to what I can overcome or concentrically lift or shorten. And that creates this ceiling, an artificial ceiling on how we're going to load exercises, right? So if I'm looking at a squat and I'm trying to develop a maximal force, that the ceiling is going to be limited by the potential I can do concentrically because I have to stand back up with it. And ways that we work around that, we start to utilize weight release hooks. We start to maybe utilize a protocol of extended eccentrics or elongated eccentric. Maybe we do a fast eccentric to create some more of a stretch reflex kind of environment and shorter amortization. There's a lot of tricks. And the thing behind that is because of the limitation of what gravity-based environments create with resistance. And I'm not saying that we can't really develop an athlete to run faster or jump higher with exclusively gravity-based stuff, because we've seen this. We've seen this time and time again, that these are time-tested, proven methods. And if we're looking at from Pareto principle, that 80% of your results are going to come from 20% of the thing, you probably should focus on compound closed kinetic chain exercises most of the time with gravity-based resistance. It's when we start to unpack maybe the second order or the long-term residuals from loading over and over and over and over that we start to limit eccentric performance. My first book, Strength Deficit, really tried to elude this fact that we're going to be limited by our concentric mindset. And we are severely undertraining eccentric loading by just having a myopic focus on whatever I can stand up for is therefore the end-all be-all of what I'm going to do from a loading perspective. There's still a lot of untapped potential eccentrically. But in a lot of the setups that we have, barbells, racks, plates, dumbbells, etc., working with large groups of athletes at a given time, it's more intuitive, it's easy to conceptualize, and better explaining it, looking at this. So if I'm thinking about the inherent shortcomings, relatively speaking, to the logistics of implementing a program, there's always going to be that conversation. But it's going to create some sort of artificial ceiling within your development. And then we can look at the impact on velocity. Because one of the things that we'll talk about here in a second is this inversion of force and velocity, that what is heavy can't be fast, and what is light can't be heavy. And that simple logic of, yeah, that makes sense. There's an inverted relationship between force and velocity in a gravity-based environment. And when we're breaking it down to a group, it's got to make sense to the large group that, hey, this is heavy, it's going to be slow. This is light, so it's going to be fast. All of that. Not saying that we're not trying to push intent, even if it is heavy, or if it even is fast. We're still pushing and encouraging people to move with maximal intent every single time they do something. But that gravity-based environment is going to limit the ultimate potential of that, specifically from an eccentric, which is the ceiling or the governor on how we're going to structure our programming. And if I'm not developing eccentric training or eccentric strength, we're probably having a severe amount of development left on the table that actually might be actually detrimental to your overall performance. And the thing that you find with eccentric, maybe I can do 130% of my 1RM concentrically. Sometimes we can look at different types of people, even detrained people might even get up to 180%, 200%. Research is always going to vary in that regard. But in truth is that there's a way higher potential from force, which has an impact, because if you look at velocity as force over time, that if I have a higher potential to produce force, therefore I'm going to have a greater capacity to produce higher amounts of velocity at heavier weights, so therefore I'm more efficient or powerful. And then I can start to look at it from, okay, well, I'm going to be limited by that. And I don't know that's a limitation until I realize there's another way to provide resistance that accommodates basically that eccentric load by whatever my concentric ability is. And I'm never detraining this eccentric loading or the higher ceiling force generating potential from a contraction type perspective when I'm doing isokinetic or isoinertial, because the intent is always maximal. And the thing that you think about right now, and if you were going to pause at any moment, it'd be here. This isn't red pill, blue pill kind of thing. This is that truth of we're always running with a governor. And if I have 100 athletes in front of me, they all got to stand up with their weights. I want to have rep integrity. I want to have set integrity. I want to have training second integrity, which comes down to having a predetermined range of motion, position at that range of motion, a predetermined number of reps per set, and a predetermined maybe time under tension, and a predetermined optimal load, whether I use a RM intensity or I look at reps in reserve or I look at rep brackets or maybe I look at velocity zones, that I'm going to have some sort of prescription for those athletes to do that. And for me to say that I'm doing my job every single day, that maintaining that range of motion, position that range of motion, hitting all their reps or that rep bracket, that time under tension, or stay within that velocity zone. And then the final aspect is hitting every single set for every single exercise that's prescribed in that workout. Did my job. Great. Awesome. But there's a lot to be left on the table of you're prioritizing logistics and execution, which again, Pareto principle is going to be the biggest part of your job. That's your job every single day to ensure that your athletes know the assignment and execute on that assignment. But there's maybe a lot to be said about what is untapped from an eccentric loading perspective, because it's so limited by what you can do concentrically. And that impacts that force velocity curve. And if we look at this next slide, it kind of goes into qualities. And this is an important slide from, we're transitioning to this, okay, concentric oriented lifting or limited lifting is going to have an impact on all the qualities. If I look at my ability to produce force, it's what I can overcome concentrically. If I look at power or velocity, it's that ceiling that's created by lifting or going governed by whatever the weakest contraction type is concentrically. Or if I look at a work or work capacity, that if I look at force over distance or duration, I can think about this idea of, well, if I can't exert over a long period of time because I'm concentrically limited, then I'm leaving a lot of stuff on the table. But it falls into that energy system zone when we talk about these different time under tension brackets. So if we look at power, under 10 seconds. If we look at relative strength, we look at 20 seconds. We look at hypertrophy, under 40 seconds, or functional hypertrophy, 40 seconds. If we look at hypertrophy, under 70 seconds. And we look at muscular endurance, anything there beyond. That, again, whatever my intensity I could utilize for power, relative strength, functional hypertrophy, or even muscular endurance is going to be limited by this simple truth that whatever I can concentrically overcome is going to be the determinant factor of what I'm going to be able to do. And it goes into that force velocity curve, right? So we look at velocity over here, we look at work capacity over there, force is somewhere in the middle. Force is going to pull everything up. So we talk about strength as the mother of all qualities. That's trying to create a higher ceiling, but that's still got an artificial block when we only focus on what we can concentrically lift. And I'm going to pause right now and really insert the idea of flywheel. That flywheel isn't governed by your concentric. What it is, it's governed by your intent and your effort. And the more effort and the intent you do, the greater the eccentric load. And the eccentric load now becomes modulated and organized as this kind of regulatory thing as you're going through a flywheel or isokinetical. And if we think about something like a eccentric exercise or eccentric focus, it's a failed isometric that as I start to lower, essentially I'm lowering slowly to organize myself to try to get this static contraction. I'm not, but I'm yielding to that load. And that's kind of a trick that we can start to increase that ceiling eccentrically within a traditional compound closed kinetic chain exercise. But in the other note, as I start to look at flywheel, it's the momentum that wheel as I start to pull, or maybe I'm squatting or hinging or whatever my big primary patterns of that flywheel is, I can now increase that eccentric load by the intent in which I'm moving. And then I can increase that eccentric demand by maybe going to a smaller wheel and creating more momentum, and that wheel is now turning faster, and it creates a much more violent eccentric load. We'll talk a little bit about this delayed eccentric, which creates this reactive force. If I pull hard all the way through, or if I squat hard, there's a laggard effect going into the eccentric, and it creates a shock that as I go through that middle of the range where I'm mechanically strongest, that where I'm most perpendicular to the ground, I have the most sarcomeres overlapping, that we start to create a spike in eccentric load maybe midway through that exercise based off the velocity at which you're moving or the intent which you're moving, which is a unique and novel stimulus. But the point being of Flywheel is it kind of like strips away all these kind of parameters and models we have to think about with traditional gravity-based resistance. As we move forward this, we look at the force velocity curve, and we look at high force. So we look at a true maximal strength all the way down to high velocity and looking at maximum velocity. And we know from an RM perspective, like 90 to 100% is going to be this absolute strength, maximal strength, whatever you want to term it. And we look at all the way on the other end, 30% is going to be this maximal velocity. And there's kind of stuff in the middle, like 30 to 80% is peak power. And that kind of ranges based off the exercise or the organization of that. And you find that like, that's a pretty big gap for power, right? Let's say that I want to focus on power and developing that. Different exercises like a bench, and if you ever do bench press if you track velocity on bench press versus a squat, the range of motion, the biarticular joints, the function of those joints as I'm going through that sticking point, has a tremendous effect on what the rate limiting effect of velocity, right? So one of the things we talk a lot about with our clients and athletes is you're probably not going to get many reps below 0.3 meters per second on a traditional squat or deadlift. That if you get like 0.25, you probably don't have a second rep at that. You've reached that velocity threshold where it's no longer to be there and it's going to turn ugly. You don't see that as much for bench because it's a shorter range of motion. You can see people grind out 2 or 3 reps well below that 0.2 meters per second. And that kind of changes the parameters a little bit, and it doesn't create these hard and fast rules to live by. And one thing that's nice about Flywheel is I'm not vulnerable when I reach these points where what I'm saying doesn't longer make sense. It's not a universal truth. And the exercise selection, the angle, the orientation, the range of motion, all this stuff is just more auto-regulatory. That what you are capable of governs the input to get that output. And it's an amazingly organic solution to all these things that are going on, these phenomena that we're trying to manage and create hard and fast rules. And you start to look through velocity zones. So again, it goes into that continuum of this inverse relationship with force and velocity. And I always think down of like, all right, does it need to be heavy, fast, or long? Right? That's just a simple thing. And I look at an athlete, all right, they're deconditioned, they need to go long. If I look at an athlete who's weak, they need to go heavy. If they are slow, they need to go fast. And just breaking up into that like simple, very easy to understood, intuitive breakdown, but kind of goes into this velocity zone, right? Like what does that athlete need to work on? And where do they need to spend the majority of their training? And again, this is going to be concentrically limited, but if it's weak, okay, absolute strength. They're going to have to live and die under this 0.5 meters per second zone. If they're slow, they're probably going to go all the way down to starting strength. It's above 1.3 meters per second. That it should look, feel, and smell like their deficiencies and their gaps based off of force velocity profiling. And there's a whole bunch of testing that we'll talk about here in the next presentation. But that thought process, I'm just trying to build this mindset of, okay, well, I'm building up a program and a prescription to organize this. But let's talk about that, because I think as we start to look through velocity and how this kind of interacts with load, and I start to profile my athletes, okay, they're slow, they're fast, or they're weak, they're strong, and I need to create some sort of balance of that. Maybe we need to double down on the strength because they're offensive linemen, and who cares about how fast they are? They just need to be brute strong, they're road graders. Maybe they're wide receiver that's really fast, but I want to make them even faster. Again, it's going to have to fall into this, okay, I have to pick a camp and load them up and push into that direction. But we start to think about this load potential, like 30% is that velocity zone. We start to get that 30 to 80% is power, and that kind of breaks down to the qualities, right? Like if I want to really focus on starting strength, it's going to have to be 0.3 meters and above. In this example, 0.39 to 0.25, right? And a lot of stuff by Brian Mann, Travis Mash, some really great resources from all the VBT guys out there. And they're just working with gravity, and they're working with these tools of a barbell. That's probably the only area that you can really utilize with velocity-based training. And this is kind of the shortcoming, right? We talk about single leg exercises. We talk about different types of actions, different motor actions, different orientations. Like what if I want to really work on starting strength in the frontal or transverse plane? I'm kind of limited from a VBT perspective. Maybe I have pneumatic resistance with Kaiser and I can look at peak power outputs there. Maybe I can look at maybe some other aspects. And one of the things that we can really talk about with dictating load, because this will be a question you'll have, is how do I know how to load this? Is velocity. Velocity is inertia. And we can look at this relationship between, if we want to create more inertia, we're going to have more intent. And that comes down to how fast or how slow I'm actually moving. And if it's very high force and I'm giving a lot of intent, okay, well, that's a pretty good indicator based off of what that velocity is or isn't. And we'll talk about that as we start to look at the impact of hitting multiplanar and multi-vector type training is giving some sort of feedback in the frontal and transverse plane or the rotational vector, which we don't have with traditional VBT because it's going to be very barbell centric. And again, Pareto principle, that's going to be a big part of what you're doing. But what I'm trying to paint a picture of is a lot of the things how we organize our training and articulate this to our athletes and give us some sort of diagnostic whether we are doing the job that we're supposed to be doing based off the needs and demands of our athletes and the goals that we may have is going to be predicated off of the limitations of gravity-based resistance. And I'm not saying that it's not a great solution, but what I'm saying there's a lot of gaps and blind spots that we just don't perceive or understand. And once we start to see there's potential with different resistance that's not gravity-based, you can start to reframe what is good intentional training. I love this prescription, and I think about this quite a bit from this heavy, fast, and long type of decision tree that I'm making. But if I look at an athlete, specifically in weightlifting, let's say that you're a world-class weightlifter, and you're like, man, I want to get to set a world record, and we start to look at the ratio of your clean and snatch, and there's a clean's going to be higher, much like back squat or front squat, or flat bench and incline bench, or if we look at something like those probably the trap bar deadlift versus a snatch grip deficit deadlift. Like we're just going to have more potential based off the range of motion, the mechanical advantage, the position at load, distance from center of mass, all that stuff's going to have an impact on load. But we can start to break that down. Like, okay, well, do you need to work more speed or do you need to work more of the strength? We can look at another continuum of like people who are really good in the 10 meter versus 100 meter. And okay, top end speed versus acceleration. But this is a good example in the weight room. And you can start to triangulate, okay, is it a speed problem or a strength problem? And if you can snatch 85% or more than you clean, it's clearly they need to work on force. They need to improve their strength. If they're below 85%, they need to work on velocity. And yes, it's a pretty like limited audience could do that, but you can extrapolate that to everyone else, right? We can look at back squat to front squat ratio. We can look at back squat at different intensities and your velocity with that. Like there's plenty of great prescription models off of looking at your rate of force development based off the intensity you're using, right? So if you're 0.35 at 90% and you're 0.37 at 40%, definitely a speed problem. And what I want you to think about is how you're addressing these issues when you're working with these athletes, and how are you giving them that feedback that they need to work harder or push harder in this direction that's so clearly neglected. But the final aspect, and we talked about this in the introduction, is this convergence effect. When you go into your training program with gravity-based stuff, you have to pick a horse. Like, we're going to work velocity, and I'm going to have to really rally everyone around that. Light and fast, giving them feedback with velocity-based training, looking at the actual speed, the eyeball test, using accommodating resistance. That, hey, we're really going to commit to this, and you got to get on a horse. And I've gone to the lengths of, hey, setting it up of, let's create a visual when they walk into the locker room, what they want to think about today during training. Today is a high rate of force development day. We want to be Cheetos. We want to be fast. We want to be explosive. You're thinking these metaphors and these imagery and this depiction, and you're trying to organize the rest periods to accommodate very high CNS work. You're trying to organize your strength training of like, no, 30%. Fast as humanly possible. I want that bar flying. I want that bar smoking with so much heat's going off. And you find yourself having to work to really explain and justify the decisions you're doing because you know that's necessary. And one thing that you find with Flywheel, it's organic. I just changed the wheel out. It's going to go faster. It's going to be bigger wheel. It's going to go slower. And all you're saying is just give maximal effort. That's it. I want you to squat with this belt harness and the flywheel attached to the ground with maximal effort. That it's going to be a small wheel and it's going to be fast. And it's going to be jarring. You're going to have a massive delayed effect, eccentric effect when you go down. React to the load, stay tight, brace, and drive through. Hey, that's a big wheel. It's going to be slow. It's going to feel like you're basically pushing a tractor trailer. Just keep grinding, keep pushing. I am regulating the load, and they're giving maximal intent, and it's regulatory to their strength. It's regulatory towards their mechanical advantage or disadvantage. It's regulatory to their just capacity or their grit. It's just organic. And one of the things that I find is so compelling about Flywheel is when I go into a training session and I know what I want to work and I know what I'm trying to do, whether it's in this force velocity continuum or I'm just looking at heavy, fast, or long, and I'm just saying, okay, this is going to be this, and I'm going to change the wheel, and I'm going to try to govern that by trying to get them and all I'm telling them is just push as hard as humanly possible. Make sure their squat pattern's there, make sure their hinge pattern's there, make sure their push and pull patterns are there. Technique is always good, range of motion, position at that range of motion, execute, execute, execute. But give them the freedom to push as hard as humanly possible without thinking about anything else. And I'm not working as hard to convey or sell them or justify what I'm doing. I'm just saying, come in, get in there, train as hard as humanly possible, go home, recover, let's come back tomorrow and train hard again. And that's where Flywheel really steps in. It really, really does. And you're going to find, and I implore you right now, is to think about where your blind spots are with your gravity-based resistance. And you might have made a decision to get some machines in there. And a lot of them are all the same kind of thing. When we look at cams and we look at the cable columns, a lot of those are going to be gravity-based, but we organize the leverage and mechanical advantage by having more or less cams, and that changes the resistance profile. Sometimes we can toggle between the strength curve and adjust based off of that, hey, where that positional load is going to be. All these things are great solutions, but again, it's still limited to the fact that gravity is dictating the way we're going to configure or move our body around that gravity, and Flywheel kind of changes it out. Okay, so pausing right there. Think a lot to unpack. I'm not red pill, blue pilling you here. I just want you to think right now, looking at your program, all of it's probably predominantly gravity based. You're listening to this video, maybe you utilize some Flywheel already in your training. You're trying to process that. And there's still a lot to unpack. So obviously we got a lot of things to go to in that direction, but pause, think, step for now forward. If you want to jump ahead to the programs that we have there for potentiation, hypertrophy, and energy system development, just kind of get a visual of like, okay, now I can start to see how this picture coming together. Great. And I go through a couple different examples of how we want to do this from a concurrent method, a conjugate method. Maybe we look at it from a block undulating periodization, from accumulation, intensification. All that stuff's going to be there.